Good evening, everyone. On behalf of St. Raymond's and St. Mary's parishes, I welcome you back to the Catholic Faith Explained. We've had a nice little break here, but good to be back. And we will begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Father, as we reflect this evening on the seemingly insignificant island of Malta, we marvel at how your providence works through weak instruments. And we ask you to make us your instruments and trust in your goodness and abandon ourselves to your will. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Malta, it's probably something you haven't heard a lot about, many of you. And before I forget, I do want to issue one little caution at the beginning. The second half, there's a couple of points, because it does involve history of siege warfare, where there's a couple of troubling things. I'll try to keep it as family-friendly as possible, but can't hide all of that. So just keep that in mind if you have children in the audience, the second half. So Malta is a rock in the middle of the Mediterranean, and seemingly insignificant, and yet the world would be a very different place today if it was not for this island, for at least a couple reasons. We'll see that. You can see here on the map on the right side, just a tiny speck in the middle of the smack in the middle of the Mediterranean. And the island itself, 18 miles by 9 miles. Very, very tiny. The country of Malta today, which is part of the EU, also includes the island of Gozo, just to the north, and this tiny little island of Comino. That's Malta. Seemingly insignificant, but very significant. We'll see why. It all happened, what I'm reflecting on, 5 years ago, Thanksgiving week, 2008. And those of you who are astute might say, well, wait a minute, there's no Thanksgiving in Rome. It's true, it's an American holiday. That's very odd as an American to be in Rome, and that was my first November in Rome, where you have classes scheduled that Thursday and Friday, and the whole world goes on like normal, except for these crazy Americans that do their Thanksgiving thing. But within our little bubble at the Casa, we did it up big. We all skipped our classes, of course, to get together for Thanksgiving, and had Mass with then Archbishop Burke, now Cardinal Burke, our former bishop, and a wonderful dinner. They did their best. You know, you have Polish sisters in the kitchen working together with a couple of Italian staff, trying to serve Thanksgiving dinner for 65 American priests. They've seen pictures, they've seen movies, they try this must be what it's like. It was good. It wasn't quite your typical Thanksgiving dinner. It starts with pasta, and then turkey, and then desserts, and then digestivi in the courtyard afterwards. And it was almost 60 degrees and sunny out that day, so we sat around for hours laughing it up and singing My Country 'Tis of Thee and things like that. The two English priests made a point of singing God Save the Queen at the right line of the song, and then they had projectiles thrown at them. They toasted Her Majesty, and most of the guys got all rowdy about that, but I said, yeah, she needs all the help she can get. God save the Queen, that's right. Anyway, we finished our Thanksgiving dinner, and the next day, 4 of us went on a 3.5 day weekend to Malta. Keeping in mind, classes were scheduled that Friday, classes were scheduled that Monday, and I did not do this often, where I just decided I'm not going to class today. That does happen sometimes in Rome, but there's very good advice that I was given. Don't let classes get in the way of your education, and that is important, and I didn't do that, but I did go most of the time. You are required by the university there to frequent your lectures, which means 3/4 of the time you're supposed to show up. So that's the standard there. And certainly there were students that didn't even do that. I did much more than that. But this was a rather spontaneous trip. I do tend to plan ahead most of the time, those of you who know me. But my friend planned this, and it was kind of spur of the moment. It all came together just a week before. And we all said, yeah, let's go to Malta. 4 of us went for this long weekend in Malta. Really not planned, but very blessed. I mentioned already how St. Anthony always seems to look after me when I travel. And in this case, we all felt like St. Paul himself was guiding our trip. We'll see what I mean by that. Even though we were not really well planned out, we managed to survive. Thankfully, there were 4 of us, because almost everywhere we went, we took taxis. But you split that 4 ways, it's not so bad. And the tour guide, the tour agent, put us up in St. Julian's. She thought she was being just really helpful to us, putting us where all the nightlife was, and we said, yeah, no thanks, we don't need any of that. But we in hindsight, we would have preferred to stay in the more historical places, so we had to take cabs to get to them. And no matter where we wanted to go, it seemed like we'd ask people, how do we get to this place? Oh, you should probably take a cab. Well, how long is it going to take? Oh, about 20 minutes. Well, how much is that going to cost? Oh, about 20 euro. No matter where. we wanted to go to the site of the Great Siege, about 20 minutes. Or we wanted to go to the ancient capital of Medina, where St. Paul spent the winter, same thing. So it reminded me of that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Well, ain't this place a geographical oddity? About 20 minutes from everywhere. That's how it was. But Malta is Catholic, very much so. Less Catholic than it used to be, but still, by most standards, very Catholic. 95%. That's dramatically down. It used to be virtually 100% Catholic. And abortion's still very much illegal there, compared to almost any other country. As far as I can tell, perhaps they look the other way if there's a woman who has felt her life threatened and chose to have an abortion, and choose not to enforce the law in those cases by punishing her. But other than that, full legal protection for the unborn. Just a couple anecdotes from our trip. Our Italian touring agency, they're not always the best at the service industry there. We've been over that. And so we were waiting for about an hour at the airport. We were supposed to have a ride arranged. I never work with tour agencies, but my friend did. So we wound up getting a cab anyway. Meanwhile, we were chatting with this security guard. He was thrilled to meet 4 American priests and talk with us and asked us all kinds of questions. And he was lamenting how Malta is losing its Catholic faith. He says, when I was young, we used to sleep on the floor. Not because we were poor, but because it would save souls. And just doesn't happen anymore. So likewise, very, very wonderful on that Sunday. We wanted to go to Mass. We concelebrated at the Co-Cathedral of St. John in Valletta. And the cab driver parked a cab, came in and joined us at Mass and prayed. And he wasn't looking for extra money. We tried to give him more money. He wouldn't take it. He took the 20 euro, and it took about 20 minutes. And other than that, he wanted to come to Mass with us. Very neat to see those kinds of things, inspiring. The deep Catholic roots, of course, go to St. Paul himself. This is a less known passage in Scripture, especially to us Catholics. It never comes up in the lectionary, not on Sundays, not even for daily Mass. So it's kind of worth taking a look at some of those details. It's really a fascinating little section at the very end of the Acts of the Apostles there. St. Paul is being taken by ship to Rome for his trial. And they run into bad weather right away. They're having trouble getting there before the winter. And Paul at one point warns them. He has a premonition that this is not going well, and he says, men, I can see that this voyage will result in severe damage and heavy loss, not only to the cargo and the ship, but also to our lives. He encourages them to hold off and not push forward. But they get a south wind and they say, you're wrong, Paul. We're fine. We can get up there with this south wind. They start going, and very quickly a dreaded nor'easter comes. They're dreaded on the East Coast here, and they're dreaded in the Mediterranean there. And really messes them up. For 14 days, they are tossed about with almost no control of their ship. They start throwing out cargo to save themselves. Eventually, they throw out everything, even the stuff they need to run the ship. So that basically they're just hoping to get rescued at that point and save their lives. And then they're all discouraged and ready to abandon ship after 14 days. And then Paul encourages them and has another premonition and says, we need to stay on the ship if you want lives to be saved. And he says, today's the 14th day. You've been waiting, going hungry, eating nothing. I urge you to take some food. It will help you to survive. He encourages them. They eat. They get some strength. They lighten the load. They even throw the leftover bread into the sea. They manage to find their way to this island, and then they run on a sandbar and shipwreck. But they manage then to get rescued in the bay, pulled ashore, and they find out the island is Malta. And here you see the scene on the shore where St. Paul assists them in, and the natives in starting a fire, because it's cold and damp. It's this time of year, and they start a fire. And while he's gathering firewood, a viper grabs his hand, and the natives say, "This man must be a murderer, and God is punishing him." And he shakes the snake off, and he's completely unharmed. And then they realize he must be a man of God. And he winds up healing the father of Publius, one of the Roman landowners on the island. And they wind up taking them in and staying there the whole winter. There were well over 270, I think, or 260, something like that, on this ship. Fascinating story. But the Maltese will insist very strongly that this is how the Catholic faith started in Malta, with the preaching of St. Paul and his 3 months of winter there. And we've been Catholic ever since. And don't you ever tell the Maltese otherwise. So it was extra special because 2008 was, as some of you remember, the year of St. Paul. Pope Benedict encouraged us, just like we are in the year of faith this year, was the year of St. Paul. That was a special year to be in Rome, obviously, and it was special to be in Malta and really feel close to St. Paul and ponder his great life during that time there that we were in Malta, those few days. We went to Medina, which means the city. It is an Arabic root to that word, just like the Arabic city Medina in Saudi Arabia. And the Maltese are originally Phoenicians. So they are related ultimately to the Philistines of the Old Testament, to the Lebanese today, to the Carthaginians of the ancient world, the sea peoples that spread all over the Mediterranean, barrel-chested, short-legged, tough people. So this was the ancient capital, and this was where St. Paul spent his winter in Malta. So we got to see a beautiful view of the island from Medina. It's one of the highest points there in Malta. You can see how small things are. I mean, this is looking more than half the island. You can see here, and you can still see the shore on the far side. So it's just not that big, but very big historically, as we'll see. Big because St. Paul lived there. Think if he had shipwrecked, how different history would have been if he had never made it to Rome and had not been martyred in Rome. Because Peter and Paul gave their lives in Rome, that changed almost everything in church history in terms of the Pope being in Rome, in Italy, of all places, to be the place where the Pope lives and works from, with all that comes with that, good and bad. But that was definitely part of God's providential plan. And against all odds, Paul was saved at Malta and made his way to Rome. So we went there looking for St. Paul's place where he stayed. We go up to St. Paul's Cathedral in Medina. Here we are, and people say, "Oh no, this isn't where he stayed. You got to go over to the next town, over in Rabat. There's another church of St. Paul there." We think, "Oh great, another 20 euro, another 20 minutes." Well, it was actually only about 8 blocks away. We walked. It was a nice walk. We got there to the Grotto Church, but it was locked. We didn't plan anything, like I said. So we thought, well, at least let's pray here with St. Paul. We prayed evening prayer together. We prayed the rosary, began praying the rosary. The gardener overhears us. He comes over and talks to us, and he says, "Oh, you want to see the church? Here, come on." He leads us in, and we get a free tour of the church there, even though it was locked. Wonderful generosity of God and St. Paul and St. Anthony. We went down to the grotto there where they say this is where St. Paul was imprisoned for the winter, in this little cave. And you see a plaque on the bottom. John Paul II visited there on a pilgrimage. You see a very unique sanctuary lamp that hangs there. This was a gift to them in 1960, 1900 years after the shipwreck, as a gift commemorating. So that's the only time I've ever seen a tabernacle sanctuary lamp in the shape of a ship, but it works. And so we all split up, made a holy hour. Some guys went to the church, some guys went to this other part, I got the grotto. I was really thrilled to spend an hour sitting on the cold, damp stone down there and just imagining St. Paul's life, being a prisoner in chains for the gospel, and whether or not this is the exact spot, who cares? In my mind, it really helped my imagination come alive to think Paul was on this island. He was a prisoner in chains for the gospel as he was brought to Rome. He had so many people that he cared about that he could do nothing about. He knew of their problems. He heard of their problems. Now he didn't know what exactly was going on with them. Certainly couldn't do anything physically about it, and yet his prayers and his suffering and his personal offering, his trust in God's goodness were supreme in those moments. And that just gave me so much comfort and strength, continues to anytime I think of his life. Whenever we feel like things are just too much, or we feel like, how can I possibly make a difference in this situation? Well, think of St. Paul. He trusted in God. He recognized that Jesus is the one in charge, and accomplished great things. It was a very inspiring holy hour. We came back the next morning to be able to offer Mass on the altar that they say this is where Publius was baptized by St. Paul. So we offered Mass together there. Very grateful. That last morning in Malta was just surreal. Very interesting experiences. We had Mass at this site, and then afterwards the debate had begun. My friend said, wouldn't it be great to rent a boat and zoom around the island? I was not in favor of this idea for multiple reasons. I protested. This is me in June this year. My friends thought it would be a great idea to go deep sea fishing. That did not go well. And you see the first mate here having fun, getting his picture taken with me. That was on Facebook before I even woke up. But I was in much better shape at this point than I was an hour previously, trust me. The same thing happened to me when I was 10 years old on Lake Michigan. So I'm not a big fan of the wide open water. Little lakes are fine. I love fishing, but not that kind of stuff. Well, that was one of the big reasons. So another reason, of course, was St. Paul himself. I mean, he shipwrecked earlier than December 1st. This was Monday, December 1st. And a nor'easter struck their boat in the fall and sunk it. Is this really a good idea? We went around asking on Sunday for, is there a place you can rent a boat? People said, I don't think you can do that this time of year, not during the winter. But seriously, guys, this does not sound like a good idea to me. Didn't work out so well for St. Paul. Well, I lost. The other three won. I also wanted to save money because I try to travel frugally so I can travel to more places. But Father Matthew was very excited. We got our boat. It was like 60 euro each. It was certainly affordable. And as it turns out, they were totally right. It was absolutely worth it. We traveled along the northern coast here first to this area up here, which there's a little lagoon here nestled in between those islands called the Blue Lagoon. Very popular tourist destination in Malta. But as you can see, on December 1st, we had the whole thing to ourselves. Spectacularly beautiful. And it was 70 degrees that day, that December 1st. Meanwhile, a couple days later, it snowed heavily back here. Imagine that. We walked all over this uninhabited island of Caminoto. There's just lizards there and no people. We prayed morning prayer. We just kind of enjoyed a few hours of real wonderful beauty and solitude on this beautiful location. We went swimming for an hour in 70-degree weather. It's the only time I can ever think of where I just went outdoors swimming in December. Really a fun morning. My friend, Father David, got us in a little bit, almost in serious trouble. He was a Boy Scout, and he was showing off his skills in turning a rope into pulleys and pulling the boat up further and further onto the shore. This, almost 1-ton boat. And we reminded him after a while, we've got to get that back in the water. And you can't tie the ropes to the water to pull it back in the water. It took all four of us a lot of effort and skill and strategy to ease it back in, barely. It almost was not a fun morning after all. One of my friends joked then, the plan B had been, well, okay, if we can't rent a boat, maybe we can take a ferry around the island. And he looked at the ferry going by. He said, guys, we could have taken the ferry. What were we thinking? Mocking me for being on the wrong side of that debate. But I admitted I was wrong. So we said goodbye to the Blue Lagoon, where we had spent a few wonderful hours, and headed to the most important thing that we wanted to see that day, which was the site of St. Paul's shipwreck. And on the way, we saw this cliff, and one of the guys says, that looks a lot like the cliff in that movie, The Count of Monte Cristo. And I thought a minute, and I said, wait a minute. And we went and looked it up when we got back, and sure enough, the whole movie was filmed there. And in fact, I need to check on this, but I think the finding of the treasure in that movie was in the Blue Lagoon where we were. So it was kind of neat to see these places in person where a movie is filmed. They filmed dozens of movies in Malta. It's a popular filming site. We went back around and found our way to St. Paul's Bay, it's called today. And there's this little island commemorating the sandbar there where he shipwrecked. And we wanted to pay our respects and ask his prayers and thank him for a wonderful weekend. And so we were able to walk up and do that. Here's the view from that island of the harbor, the bay where they shipwrecked, and on the far side there where they were pulled ashore. And you can see all kinds of fishing operations going on. It's always been a fishing island. And like I said, all of history would be different had St. Paul not been rescued at Malta and spent those 3 months there. He never would have made it to Rome, never would have been a martyr at Rome, and everything would have been radically different. It's amazing to think on these things, how God's providence works in the smallest details. He knows what he's doing. Definitely an amazing morning that finished our time there. The other big reason we were there, the other reason why Malta forever changed human history, why we're very different than we would have been without Malta, is the siege, the Great Siege it's often called, of 1565. This is probably completely new to many of you. Fascinating history. I mean, those of you who are military history buffs will enjoy this segment more than others. I'll try not to get bogged down in that too much, but some of the details are just too interesting to pass up, as well as the big picture of what impact this has had on human history. Very significant. The Turks were at the peak of their power at this point, the Ottoman Turks, and they sent 40,000 well-trained troops to obliterate the knights who were stationed now on Malta, riding in almost 200 war galleys. And all told, there were about 700 knights. That was after calling whoever they could from Europe to come help them. 700 knights on the island. About 3,000 Spanish troops that were sent to help them, and 5,000 Maltese who were not soldiers, were very tough because over the last several decades leading up to this, they had been repeatedly plundered by the pirates of the Barbary Coast, northern Africa, and by the Turks, who frequently raided and pillaged those islands of Malta. So the Maltese were not thrilled to have these new overlords, and the knights did not treat them the best all the time, but they were certainly much happier to die alongside the knights than to have anything to do with the Turks that they had absolutely no love for over those decades. So that's how it was. Amazing. About 9,000, not all trained, held out against 40,000 and won. How that happened is remarkable. We'll just see a few of those details. They are called the Knights of Malta typically today because of the siege. They were not always called the Knights of Malta, but they were originally and still officially the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem. We'll see why in a moment. They were one of those military orders. This is very strange for us to think of today. Thinking of monks, religious, who are committed to fighting. They vows of chastity, vows of poverty, vows of obedience, and a firm commitment to fight the infidel. This just doesn't seem quite right. Fighting monks, but that is what there was. There were the Knights Templar and the Teutonic Knights, but both of those, either were suppressed or faded away, or were in far reaches where it no longer had a significant impact on the rest of the world. But the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem always persisted. We'll see why. And they're still around today. They no longer fight anymore, but they still do their original work, which was hospital work. So they are also called the Hospitallers, those of you who studied the history of the Crusades. They started at a hospital in Jerusalem, a Benedictine-run hospital, in honor of St. John the Baptist that took care of the sick and wounded. And from there branched out to have multiple hospitals, which were not just hospitals for the sick and wounded, but also guest houses, safe passage, safe travel for pilgrims coming from Europe to the Holy Land. And at times, safe passage was incredibly difficult, hence the fighting side of this order. They were a nursing order that took care of the sick and the dying, and they were a fighting order that guaranteed safe passage to the Holy Land. And at various times in their history, they've been more tilted towards the nursing versus the fighting. But always both mixed in there, until more recently. Now they don't fight anymore, like I said. So the hospitality, I already covered that. The secular historian Gibbon comments kind of snidely, sarcastically about them. They neglected to live serving Christ by their lives, but they sure were prepared to die for Christ. And as you see during the siege, they readily did that, gave their lives for what they were convinced was the cause of Christ. And they were in decline at this time until their most recent Grand Master took over, La Valette. But they were, at various times in their history, not real enthusiastic about their chastity or their poverty. And that's all well known. But and they not, or their obedience, not always coming when they were beckoned, and they were struggling with membership because parts of Europe now were no longer Catholic, and they actually had only one Englishman anymore. They used to have all kinds of them. Ironically, today most of them are English, I discovered. But so they were in decline, but the Grand Master La Valette whipped them into shape, and how. The cross, the Maltese cross, you've probably seen before. It's kind of well, it's their branding, I guess you could say. We would say today, 8 points on that cross. Obviously, the 8 Beatitudes that symbolizes, as well as originally at this time in the 1500s, they were formed into 8 different regions. They were called langues, tongues, languages from different parts of Europe, and that were all represented in the knights. As I said, only one Englishman at this time because Henry VIII had done away with them. The 8 points represent their 8 virtues that they promoted. These were their 8 virtues: loyalty, piety, frankness. My 3 friends and I loved that one. We thought, well, I wish more people would would practice that virtue where you know where people are coming from. None of this beating around the bush. But bravery, honor, contempt of death. They certainly showed that repeatedly during the siege. Helpfulness toward the poor and sick, they always have showed that in their history as well. Respect for the church. Interesting virtues. Not all of these are well kept today. Certainly, I think all of these have their merits and are worth looking at. Just to give some background here, we went over a little this when we talked about Spain. But to try to appreciate, I mean, there's troubling content on both sides in this siege, you know. And I'm not going to pretend to justify any of that. But we do have to appreciate that in the first 100 years, Islam spread so rapidly, and how threatened the Europeans felt by this. I mean, all the way through what today is Portugal and Spain and into France, before they were finally turned back in 732. And then a 700-year process of reconquering what today is Spain. As we mentioned, very ugly at the end. A lot of atrocities against the Muslims and the Jews in the 1500s. So finally, the Spaniards had a handle on things in the West, but the Turks, however, were growing and quite a threat to Europe. And they had, as you can see, they had taken over what today is southern Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, and they already made it once to the gates of Vienna. I believe it was 1521, and were turned back. And they had significant control of the Mediterranean. Not total control, but were very strong in the Mediterranean. The French cut a deal with them, as one maybe would expect. So the French had free passage through the Mediterranean under the condition that the French would never get involved in conflicts against the Turks. But everybody else was immediately threatened if they tried to bring any ships through the Mediterranean. Either threatened in the west because there were pirates on the Barbary coast, or threatened in the east by the Turks. And the Knights of St. John, during all this time, they were originally crusaders. The Holy Land was lost. They had a new headquarters on Rhodes, which is this island just off of modern-day Turkey. And from there, they heavily resisted the Turks and were eventually beaten off the island by the Turks. They surrendered under terms and were allowed passage to leave and left, surrendered. And then they were hoping to find a new home, and they really weren't getting any support or help from any of the leadership in Europe. Finally, the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V of Spain, gives them this little rock in the middle of the Mediterranean, Malta, not nearly as nice as Rhodes in terms of lusciousness or fertility of the land or comfort of the climate. And he insists that they also have to take and try to defend Tripoli, which didn't work out. That quickly fell. But they took the deal, they took Malta, and it proved very helpful because it's right in the middle of the Mediterranean. And they were sort of like police, I guess you could say, trying to keep the pirates at bay and the Turks at bay to protect safe passage for the other Europeans, but also they were themselves pirates. I think you could call them the pirates of the Mediterranean. And they frequently raided Turkish supply lines, both to gain wealth for themselves because they were struggling to keep themselves funded, and to stop the pressing of the Turks into Europe, to cut their supply lines coming up the Adriatic to supply their front lines there. So the Knights did, however, they were heavily military at this time in their history, but they immediately built a hospital in Malta when they arrived. They never lost sight of that side of their work. Still there today. To give you an idea of these galleys at the time, similar to the way they were in ancient Rome. Not a lot had changed. Both the Turks and the Europeans of various countries and the Knights in the Mediterranean had these kinds of ships, about 180 feet long. And what we have to appreciate, rowed always by slaves, and lots of them. 280 slaves for a typical galley. They had 4-foot benches, 6 slaves to a bench. Chained to that bench, nonstop. Food brought to you, and whatever else you had to do on the bench, and expected to row sometimes 10, 15, 20 hours a day to keep these going. So on the Turkish side, you had lots of Europeans that had been captured as prisoners of war or whatever else, or maybe some criminals. That were all forced as slaves to row the galleys. And on the European side, you had Turks that were captured and forced as slaves to row the galleys. Not exactly, like I said in the previous talk, the 1500s was not a high point in the way human beings treated each other. A lot of troubling things all over the known world at the time. And when we evaluate those situations, we have to keep that context in mind lest we judge too harshly, while at the same time saying, wow, thank goodness we don't do those kinds of things. At least some places in the world don't do those kinds of things. But it happens more than we realize. These ships, they were not used in the north because they're not good for bad weather. They didn't even use them in the winter. They're not real seaworthy vessels, but they're very fast for their day. I mean, if you have 280 slaves rowing, you can get things moving pretty quickly. They could even kind of turn on a dime if they were well captained, and don't do all kinds of tricky maneuvers where somebody's chasing you and all of a sudden you spin the ship around and charge. And in a well-coordinated effort can really make things difficult. They had small and large cannons on them. And like I said, the Knights often were pirates. They started with the cannons and then boarded the other ship and took the goods. They did a lot of that and were very pesky and really a thorn in the Sultan's side. So in 1564, one of the advisors tells the Sultan in Constantinople, this cursed rock is like a barrier interposed between us and your possessions. You've got to do something about Malta. This is causing us constant problems. You've heard his name probably, many of you, Suleiman the Magnificent, very famous Sultan, in many ways a real great ruler. And he decides that we do indeed have to go attack Malta and stop these Knights once and for all. And he commits to do that. There won't be any terms this time. On the Knights side, the Knights of St. John, the new Grand Master was Valette. And the perfect guy for this time for them. He himself was captured at one point as a prisoner of war and was a galley slave for a year. You can imagine. I mean, like I described those conditions. Chained nonstop for a year, and as much as 20 hours a day. So many of them just reached such a point of exhaustion, they were then just removed, flogged ruthlessly, and tossed into the sea. On both sides. This was just how things happened. But he survived all of that. He was 70 years old and tougher than ever, and very, very, very ready to lead brave knights in this siege, and a very skilled leader, as we'll see. So he quickly sets to making preparations. They had spies that noticed lots of ships suddenly being built in the shipyards over there in Constantinople, and they quickly put two and two together and knew what was coming. So they built this fort as quickly as they could. We'll see how strategic that was. Turns out Malta wasn't so bad. There's stone everywhere. It's a rock. So they were able to build a fort that held up against lots of cannon fire, for a time anyway. They got all the sick and all the lame, and anybody who was not able to serve in a military way to go to the old capital or to go up north to go remove them from the area of the siege, both for their protection and also so that they could maximize their supplies for those who were going to fight. Stockpile lots of food and water, not knowing how long they're going to have to hold out. They did have one natural spring under one of their castles that helped them greatly. And even though it was April, they harvested whatever they could, green as it was, so that there'd be nothing there for the Turks when they arrived. They destroyed all the buildings that were outside of their fortresses, so there'd be nothing for the Turks to use. They did what they could to poison wells, the water supply, so they wouldn't have. They were able to use the water, but they did get dysentery eventually. So all these kinds of things happen, and whatever ships they didn't need, they sunk them, sometimes in a way that they could raise them back up again. And they were more or less ready, as they could be on short notice, when the Turks arrived. The Army and the Navy never seemed to get along, in our military or in so many. And it was definitely true of the Turks. They had too many commanders that didn't agree all the time. They had a very able general of the ground troops, an older man, but he was often overruled by the younger admiral who had closer ties in the court in Constantinople. He was afraid to overrule him. And the admiral insisted, we can't keep our ships down here in this southern harbor. What if a nor'easter comes up? Even though he didn't realize they don't really come in the summer. But he was so afraid of that, he said, we have to first take this northern harbor here. You can see where all the battles took place were on these harbors right here on the northeastern side of Malta there. And the main fort for the knights, Fort St. Angelo, they had two castles side by side, and a creek in between them with a huge metal chain across, so that no ships could enter in. And then they had whatever boats they needed inside of there. They had a bridge of boats back and forth across those two so they could reinforce one way or the other. And guarding the entrance to this harbor is the fort that they had built. So because this admiral so insisted on this approach, he said, first we take Fort St. Elmo and we secure our fleet, then we attack the main ones. Their sources told them, we'll come back to that in a second, just want to mention among those troops, 40,000 well-trained, as I said, were the Janissaries. You may have heard of that. This too is just an interesting piece of this time in history. The author I read describes them Christian by birth, Spartan by upbringing, and fanatical Muslims by conversion. The Janissaries were one of the most amazing military corps in history. I think the analogy you might be able to draw is like, those of you who are old enough to remember, the Russian Olympic teams. I mean, they scouted the children in Russia, and they chose them from a young age, and that was their whole life. And they, in these newly conquered Christian territories, Bulgaria, Hungary, southern Poland, these Christian children were scouted out, and whoever seemed to be the best prospects were taken in, converted, polarized, in a fanatical view of Islam, and turned into fighting machines, and were one of the most effective fighting troops in history. And they were used, this was one of the most formidable things brought against Malta during this siege. So that fort was predicted to fall within 4 to 5 days. That's why it's like no big deal. We take that fort first, then we can move on from there. It absorbed 7,000 cannon shots per day were the estimates. This is how much of a beating it was taken on a regular basis, and it holds out for 31 days. So to a man, and in the end, of those 40,000 Turks, 8,000 of them were already gave their lives before they finally were able to take that fort. That was the key, really, that turned the tide in the whole course of the summer. What was I gonna? Yeah, you can see how the Turks had their cannons on this mountain and were firing, and the knights were able to send reinforcements across the harbor here for quite a lot of those 31 days. By night, they would sneak them over, but eventually it took so much cannon fire they had to stop doing that. There was one point where, here you see Valet's genius, there were 53 of the younger knights in the fort who signed a petition. They just were so convinced it was hopeless, and this was only like about 10 days into the siege, give or take. They said, we just can't hold out any longer. Please just let us evacuate the fort and come and defend the main fortress. And Valet's response was genius. His general got a lot of volunteers, and they had 600 people enlist to go and take the place of the ones in the fort. And he said, all right, you're free to come back. I'm going to send 600 in your place, and they'll hold the fort. And they were so embarrassed, and they did not want to be labeled as cowards for the rest of their lives. They wound up fighting to a man, and they all gave their lives in the final siege. Eventually, there were no more reinforcements. They held out as long as they can. And when it finally fell, the Turkish general said, Allah, if so small a son has cost us so dear, what price will we have to pay for so large a father? Looking across the harbor at the bigger fort that is yet to come. And they never did take it. So this is one of those ugly little moments where I mean, it's understandable. They took no prisoners. And that, we really can't fault the Turks for that, because the knights and the Maltese refused to surrender. They simply would not surrender. And at the time, that was just considered then, okay, then you get, there's no prisoners then. But the captains were treated with particular cruelty once the fort was taken. To send a strong message to Valet, they were nailed to these wooden planks, and without their heads or hearts, and it's not certain what order all that came in, but they were floated across the channel. And Valet was furious when he saw his friends treated this way, and he responded with even greater cruelty. And he took all the Turkish prisoners in the dungeon, had them beheaded, and with that loaded his cannons and wasted precious gunpowder to send that back as a message to the Turks. And I mean, really nasty hatred on both sides. And that's I mean, I'm sorry to put those things in, and that's the worst of it. But the reason I do will come out later. To try to find peace in the world, we have to be aware of how much hatred has gone into these conflicts over the centuries. That night, the Turks had celebratory bonfires, although it had been a hard victory for them, probably mocking the knights because it was the vigil of St. John the Baptist's birth, and he, of course, is their patron. They observed that with liturgical celebrations. So, meanwhile, they're hoping for help from Sicily, which is not that far to the north. Is part then of the Spanish Holy Roman Empire. And the viceroy in Sicily keeps making excuses. It's amazing that they were able to communicate with Sicily, but they were. The Maltese fishermen were super skilled with their small boats, and they were able to maneuver through these 200 ships and find their way to Sicily and bring messages back and forth successfully. And the viceroy kept saying, yeah, June 20th. By June 20th, I'll send the relief force. And then he kept pushing it back, and it just... Valet knew pretty early on, we can't count on anybody else's help but God alone. And he told the troops that. There's some other little details that are very memorable in the history of this. Some of them laughable, some of them amazing. Once Fort Elmo fell, and the siege focused on these two remaining castles. The knights put together a makeshift palisade. They took whatever kind of wooden beams or masts of ships or whatever they could drive into the bed of the creek on the western side there, and tied it together with any kind of metal they could find so that the ships could not land and drop troops off on the shore. And of course the Turks sent saboteurs to dismantle this, and the knights sent out the Maltese, who were champion swimmers. I mean, they grew up on an island and were very skilled swimmers, and they just stripped down and put knives in their teeth and swam, and you had this strange underwater combat fighting over this makeshift wall that was and very effective for several weeks in holding back the Turks. The first attack went very badly for the Turks on this western castle here. There was a cocky young general that came from Turkey and arrived and was chastising the head general over how long it took them to take the other fort. And if I had been here, I mean, we would have taken it in a few days. He said, all right, you lead the charge. You go right ahead and show us how it's done. Lead the charge here to attack this castle. Of course, it did not go well for him. It almost did. The main general thought he still had a master plan. When it was close to evening, he had several ships of janissaries about to arrive on the northern side and launch a surprise attack from the north, only he did not ever realize that there was a hidden battery of cannons right there. And they couldn't believe that these ships were going right in front of them at point blank range, and they sunk them all. So then the Turks pulled back and for a month just shot cannons at them to wear them down. But finally they did wear them down, and they had miners going underneath, ready to blow up from underneath the eastern castle where the headquarters was. When they did finally blow that up, the Grand Master himself, 70 years old, saw the breach, and he saw that troops were about to come in, and he jumped down himself, grabbed a pike, and led the charge, and the men rallied behind him, and they successfully stopped that. Just fascinating moments here. All of his advisors told him, we need to withdraw into the main fort, here, Fort St. Angelo. It's very defensible. Abandon these other fortresses and just make our stand there. And he said, no way. We have to make them pay for every inch before we give way, otherwise we'll lose. And he was right. And to make his point, he blew up the bridge between the castle and the headquarters. So they could not retreat there. We're making our stand here. They said, well, at least remove the relic of St. John the Baptist's hand and at least put that safely inside the fort. He said, no, we're making our stand here. And they did. One of the things that helped them against all odds, they invented these fire hoops, just oversized hula hoops, I guess you could say, but made out of metal, with all kinds of wool on them, doused in brandy and pitch and saltpeter and lit on fire and send them flying. So whenever the janissaries were about to overcome the walls, they sent several of those out, and they had these long flowing white robes, and very effective makeshift way of holding them back. These other ones are almost like Looney Tunes. I mean, it's like watching Elmer Fudd or Wile E. Coyote being foiled again. The Turks wheeled this big siege tower up where the troops can climb up, and a drawbridge comes down and they're able to come over the walls. And it wasn't looking good, but Valette himself concocted a plan where the Turks weren't really paying attention down below to the castle walls. They knocked a hole out in the lower wall of the fortress and wheeled a little cannon out there, and they put in chain shot where you have two cannonballs attached by a chain and it whistles around. You've seen this in movies maybe where they take out the mast of a ship with that. But a couple of those shots and the whole tower with all the troops in it comes tumbling down. The Turks are infuriated. They go back to the drawing board. They come back a few days later with this super reinforced tower with earth and rock all over it, and there's no way you're going to shoot this one down. And so the knights launch this surprise cavalry attack and take the tower, and they put their own troops and cannons in it, and it becomes an offensive weapon for them. And then this other one is just like I said, straight out of the Wile E. Coyote playbook, where they made this, I don't know, kind of like a long cannon barrel stuffed full of shrapnel and grape shot and gunpowder and all kinds of goodies, and the idea was to heave it over the wall and with a lit fuse, and it blows up and it knocks the wall down and takes out lots of the knights. And then we charge in and take the fortress. Well, they heave it over the wall, barely. The knights keep their cool completely, and they wheel it up the ramp and back over the wall just in time for it to blow up on the Turks. So lots of little stories like this are just very fascinating. Like I said, those who are war history buffs are going to be more interesting. My favorite was this one, the old capital, Medina, where St. Paul spent his winter. Throughout the campaign, there were just a small handful of troops that were cavalry that the knights had there, guarding the sick and the lame and the women and the children in the fortress up there. But very weak defense, I mean, aside from the walls themselves. And it was one of the mistakes that the Turks did not go there first, because throughout the summer, at very annoying moments, the cavalry would ride out and surprise attack the Turks from behind and cause all kinds of difficulties for them. There was one point where they were on the verge of taking the fortresses, and then the general called a retreat because he thought that there was a massive force in their camp, and it was just a handful of cavalry causing mischief. So finally, in August, they say, we're going to go in and wipe out these annoying cavalry. There's not that many people up there. And the governor's like, well, what do? We can't possibly defend this. So he dresses up all the women and children and old men and wounded in soldiers' uniforms, whatever he can come up with, puts them all over the walls. He takes all the gunpowder they have, and he fires as many shots from their cannons as he can get out, as if to say, we're not giving an inch here. We're loaded. You better watch out. And they immediately retreated and thought, we can't possibly take, it's another St. Elmo is what they said. It's going to be another 31 days to take this one. So they backed down from what would have been an easy victory. It was because of a clever ruse on the part of a knight. So what happens eventually here in September, the Viceroy of Sicily finally does come, long after he promised he would. And he comes with 10,000 troops. The Turks thought it was a lot more troops when they heard rumors, and they were already so worn down. They immediately pack up their tents and start loading up their boats and get ready to go home. This was the final blow, but as scholars point out, they had already lost. It was not the reinforcements that won the battle. The knights and the Maltese and the Spaniards had done that already. Interesting that it happened on September 8th, the feast of the birth of Mary, and the knights celebrated that feast, as you can imagine, with great joy and relief, ringing all the bells. Word got out all over Europe, ringing church bells, even in London, where Queen Elizabeth was reigning. And this is what she said during the siege. She said, if the Turks should prevail against the Isle of Malta, it is uncertain what further peril might follow to the rest of Christendom. Everybody in Europe knew. They weren't really eager to help the knights, but they knew if the knights were no longer on Malta, if the Turks got full naval control of the Mediterranean, very likely all of Europe comes to be under Turkish control. Like I said, the whole world would be very different today if it weren't for this rock in the middle of the Mediterranean. And I'm not saying that, there was heroism in the siege, there was savagery in the siege. Certainly not going to justify a lot of the things that happened. Of course, the same is true of World War II. We can look at a very just cause there in many ways, and yet a lot of atrocities by the supposed good guys. So we went around the island. We saw these sites that we had read about and were fascinated with. We ate at this wonderful restaurant way up on this roof overlooking the great harbor, so you can see the main fort of the knights and the other fort. This is exactly where the Turkish cannons were stationed during the siege. The chain would have been across this harbor, and they were able to hold those two forts the whole summer. And here's the main headquarters that never was assailed, that never was breached. And we tried to get in there, and very fittingly, we were denied access. The Turks couldn't get in, neither could we. Only fitting. We toured this museum, and it's interesting to see some of the stuff that was used. You can see the knights back then were not terribly big by comparison to today's people. And some of the stuff that the Turks used, their weaponry, some of the bigger cannonballs that would have been used, some of the weaponry.
Here you see how it's this very interesting transitional period where you start to have cannons and guns being used, and yet still armor. And the armor was made to resist a musket shot most of the time. Not always, didn't always work, but you can see it often did work, or thrusts with the pike. So you see here the total mix of devout Catholic faith with savage fighting, which seems very strange, like I said, to us today. And good that those two aren't mixed together today, but that is very much what was in the spirit of the knights at that time. These weapons were just fascinating to me. You'll never see them today anymore. This is a shield that has a pistol in the middle of it. So you can walk around with the shield and have a pistol protruding from it. And this is a sword gun. These intermediary periods, I just found this stuff fascinating from a historical point of view. This is one of the very first air guns in the world, the prototype model for that. This is, I don't know, it looks like a tiny little cannon that folds up and goes in your pocket just in case you need one sometime. So, very interesting stuff. But I want to look back at the larger picture to see how this all fits in. Some of you are more familiar with the Battle of Lepanto. 6 years later, October 7th, 1571, Our Lady of the Rosary is the feast day that commemorates this. Remember, all of Rome was praying the Rosary fervently because things were not looking good for this fleet that the Europeans had pulled together against the Turkish fleet, and because of a change of the wind while they were praying the Rosary, the Turkish fleet was routed and never was the same since. So those two events really turned the tide where things were looking rather grim for Europe in the face of the Turks starting to get the upper hand. But it really, Malta, as you can see from what was said, set the stage for what happened at Lepanto. And again, I'm not trying to glamorize either one of them, but the fact is the world would be very different today if these things didn't happen. Very different. So it wasn't all over. The Turks did, even though they lost naval control, they did one more time get to the gates of Vienna. I have to include this just because I'm Polish. So the King of Poland, John Sobieski, saved the day in 1683 with a surprise cavalry attack at 4 o'clock in the morning. I also mention it because some people speculate that this is an historically significant date because it's 4 a.m. on September 12th, 1683. So they would have ridden out to come to the aid of Vienna on September 11th, 1683. Some people think that might be significant in the minds of the September 11th terrorists. And actually, that's actually plausible. I don't think that's just a strange speculation. Because looking at Vienna, at Austria, for example, it's kind of ironic today. I mean, twice they had the Turks at their gates and barely held them back. And today there's like 1 million Turks there. The Europeans, as many of you know, are having very low birth rates. And there's all kinds of immigrants. And I don't think it's just random that the Turks are focusing their immigration efforts on Vienna. A lot of, the everyday people, sure, it's random. I mean, I remember being in Vienna and talking to the taxi driver. He was a Turkish Muslim, great guy. We had a wonderful talk. He's just there to support his family and make a living. Really good human being. But behind the scenes, you get the sense that there's a very strategic idea that has a deep historical memory and about the former attempts to take over Europe. Likewise on Malta, I thought this was just a little too striking to be a mere coincidence. We were in one of our cab rides around, and the cab driver said, "Oh, look, here's where they're building the mosque." And all of a sudden I said, well, wait a minute. I had this map in my mind. I'm like, here's where the Turks were camped out during the whole siege. Here's where the mosque is built. That's just a little, maybe it's coincidence. I mean, it's only 18 by 9 miles, but does it really have to be exactly on that spot? So there's a deep memory of some of these things. And as we look at them, of course, there's people, therefore, that still continue to have a very militaristic mind against jihadist Muslims. And then there's others who are sheer pacifists. And I suggest here, as we reflect more deeply on this, there's two extremes we want to avoid. We want to avoid sheer pacifism, and the Catechism is clear on this point, saying legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. So there are times in history where it is the duty of those in authority to protect the people against aggressors. There have been those times in the past, and had there not been a defense against aggressors, the world would have been a different place. That's fact. And that's not saying the way the defense was carried out was right. It usually was not. That's how war tends to work. But there is such a thing as legitimate defense. We are not sheer pacifists as Christians. It's important to remember that. But at the same time, very clear that war is not a solution. Legitimate defense is legitimate defense, but anybody who thinks that fighting wars is going to solve the world's problems is wrong. Pope Benedict XVI was very clear on this point. He said, war, with its grief and destruction, is always justly considered a calamity, in contrast with the plan of God, who created everything to give life and who wants to make mankind one family. We have to remember that and keep that in mind. So we're aware of this history, which has a lot of unpleasantness, and the present tensions, which are in many ways just as bad. These things have not gone away, and like I said, there's a deep memory of this history. I skipped a step there. This is my take. The problem with people who think that war is going to solve the problem of jihadist Islam, for example, is this cycle that is there throughout human history again and again and again. One people suffers violence, vengeance, atrocities. It fuels hatred and resentment, and then they get revenge, and then the people want revenge on them, and it never ends. And it turns out we Christians have a solution to this vicious cycle of human history. John Paul II gives great insight for us to think about on this theme. He wrote this letter just a year after the terrible September 11th attacks, as he started the year of the Rosary in 2002-2003, and he gave us those wonderful 5 luminous mysteries. But he said, the Rosary is utterly Christocentric. It all centers on Jesus. People who think, that's, why all this attention to Mary? Really, the Rosary is about Jesus. Of course, with Mary, but all those 20 mysteries, maybe with a couple of exceptions, are especially focused on Jesus. And the Hail Mary itself, John Paul says, right in the middle of it, you have the holy name, Jesus. The fruit of your womb, Jesus. He says it's almost like a hinge on which that whole prayer turns, that prayer that is repeated again and again. The whole Rosary centers on Jesus, and therefore is a compendium of the gospel. He says a compendium is like a handy textbook that summarizes the most important things. Or an analogy for you sports fans would be like you watch Sports Center. You get 1 hour, you kind of see all the big things that happened that last day in sports. Likewise, if you pray the Rosary daily, you are daily reflecting on the most important moments in the gospel. And that's a pretty good thing to do. A very helpful practice. Mary helps us in the Rosary, Pope John Paul says, to contemplate Christ in these 5 ways. We remember Christ together with Mary as we ponder those 20 mysteries. We learn about him together with Mary. We are conformed to him together with Mary. We pray through Christ to the Father together with Mary. And we proclaim Christ with her. All of those things. Beautiful to see how the Rosary helps us do all 5 of those things. And after all that, all those wonderful reflections, he also encourages us that there are 2 intentions in particular that we should be praying the Rosary for the family. Obviously, now more than ever, the family needs prayer. Pray the Rosary for families, he says. And that just makes so much sense. If we become like Jesus and like Mary in the way we love our family members, our family is going to be strong. Well, we're really concerned with this second one tonight, peace in the world. He says we need to pray the Rosary for peace in the world. This is the solution, not in the end war. Maybe legitimate defense has to happen now and then in human history, but the real solution is praying the Rosary for peace in the world. Keeping in mind, and John Paul is well aware of this history, he knows it well, and he's well aware of the present tensions and threats. And he specifically mentions September 11th. He says, at the start of a millennium, which began with the terrifying attacks of September 11, 2001, a millennium which witnesses every day in numerous parts of the world fresh scenes of bloodshed and violence. To rediscover the rosary means to immerse oneself in contemplation of the mystery of Christ, who is our peace. Consequently, one cannot recite the rosary without feeling caught up in a clear commitment to advancing peace, especially in the land of Jesus, still so sorely afflicted and so close to the heart of every Christian. Beautiful reflection there on how the rosary leads to peace in the world. Of course, he's also very much mindful of Fatima. Keep in mind, he was shot on May 13th, that important Fatima day, and the bullet that did not kill him is in the crown of Mary, Our Lady of Fatima there, and he paid his respects and thanks. Mary's promise in Fatima, many souls will be saved and there will be peace, she said to those 3 children. And what she said we need to do for that is pray the rosary, make reparation, offer up our sufferings in reparation for sins, and consecrate ourselves to Mary. Those 3 simple things. Now, it's important not to be magic about this. I've met Catholics that, the problem is the Pope, if he would have consecrated the world to Russia specifically, then there'd be peace in the world already. Well, it's not a magic formula that Mary was giving us. The reason why this will work, if it's ever really tried seriously by Christians throughout the world, is because the rosary and reparation and consecration change our hearts. We become peacemakers. We become people of peace. If we ponder Christ in those 5 ways that we went over together with Mary, we will become like him. And if there were just a few million Christians in the world who were really like Jesus and really like Mary in the way they loved others, in the way they lived the 8 Beatitudes that the Knights also were committed to in theory, we lived those Beatitudes and we lived the peace of Jesus and Mary, think of how that would transform the hearts of everybody else in the world. Then there will truly be peace. So thank you. We'll see you next time.